The driveway slopes down from a small two-lane road on the southern edge of Newtown Square, Pennsylvania, a township about 12 miles west of Philadelphia. The road is called Goshen Road. The farmhouse it leads to is small. It is set back from the road. It is surrounded by what was once dairy pasture and is, in late January of 1996, brown and frozen over. The farmhouse is part of an estate that covers approximately 800 acres. The estate has, at various points in its history, been called Lissitor Hall Farm, after the manor house at its center, and Foxcatcher Farm, after a racing stable that once operated on it. By the standards of the surrounding Delaware County, the estate is, in 1996, the largest single piece of private land. The wrestler who lives in the farmhouse moved there in 1989. Dave Schultz was born on June 6, 1959, in Palo Alto, California. He had been a difficult child to teach. He was dyslexic. He was bullied for his weight. He found his way to wrestling at Palo Alto High School under a coach named Ed Hart. He won the senior national Greco-Roman title as a high school senior in 1977. He was California state champion in the same period. He was a three-time NCAA All-American at Oklahoma State and at the University of Oklahoma. He had transferred from Oklahoma State to UCLA in the middle of his college career, but the UCLA wrestling program was discontinued during his time there, and he transferred again to the University of Oklahoma. He won the NCAA championship at 167 pounds in 1982. The following year, in 1983, he was the world freestyle champion at 74 kilograms. In the Olympic Games of 1984 in Los Angeles, he won the gold medal at the same weight, defeating Martin Knosp of West Germany in the final. He married Nancy Stauffer on Valentine's Day, 1982. They had 2 children together, a son named Alexander and a daughter named Danielle. He won 10 United States senior national titles across the decade following his Olympic gold. He was the only American to twice win the Tbilisi tournament in Soviet Georgia, then the most prestigious annual international freestyle wrestling competition. He was a 5-time World Cup gold medalist. He won the Pan American Games and the Goodwill Games in 1987. He coached, before arriving at Foxcatcher, at the University of Oklahoma, at the University of Wisconsin at Madison, and at Stanford. At Wisconsin, he coached, among others, a young undergraduate named Jim Jordan, who would later represent Ohio in the United States Congress to consecutive NCAA titles in 1985 and 1986. He arrived at Foxcatcher in 1989 with Nancy and the children. He served as Team Foxcatcher's coach. He trained at the farmhouse and at the wrestling center built on the estate for what he intended as his last competitive run, the Atlanta Olympic Games of 1996. At the time of his death, he was ranked first in the United States at 163 pounds. He was, by the assessment of the international wrestling community, the leading American freestyle wrestler of his generation and the top American prospect for gold at Atlanta. January 26, 1996, was a Friday. The temperature in Newtown Square was just above freezing. The driveway in front of the farmhouse, sloping down from Goshen Road, was paved in patchy asphalt. Dave Schultz was outside in a windbreaker, working on the radio of his car. He was 36 years old. At approximately 2:41 in the afternoon, a silver Lincoln Town car pulled into the driveway and came to a stop. 2 people were inside. The driver was the owner of the estate. He had driven, earlier that afternoon, to a stamp store in Ardmore, a few miles east of Newtown Square. He had purchased collector's stamps. He had then driven back to the estate. He had picked up his security consultant from the office at the main residence. He had told the security consultant that they would, on the return drive, inspect what he described as storm damage on the property. Dave Schultz looked up from the radio. He greeted the driver of the Lincoln. The greeting was brief. The accounts vary on the exact words. The driver rolled down his window. He raised a revolver. He said one sentence, which the security consultant in the passenger seat would later testify to in court. He fired 3 times. The first bullet struck Schultz in the elbow. The second struck him in the chest. The third struck him in the back. In the kitchen of the farmhouse, Nancy Schultz heard the first shot. She walked to the front door. She opened it. The second shot rang out as she opened it. She saw her husband on the gravel beside the open driver's side door of his car. She testified later that the driver of the Lincoln then pointed the revolver at her and screamed something she could not, in her subsequent testimony, fully reconstruct. She retreated back into the farmhouse. She picked up the telephone. She dialed 911. When the dispatcher asked her why the man in the driveway had shot her husband, she answered with 2 words that the local press would repeat for the next decade. She said, "Because he is insane." The security consultant in the passenger seat of the Lincoln town car was a former Marine officer named Patrick Goodale. He drew a small pistol from an ankle holster after the shooting. He did not fire it. The driver of the Lincoln put the revolver in his lap and reversed out of the driveway. He drove the half-mile or so back to the main residence at the center of the estate. Goodale, in the passenger seat the entire time, did not stop him. Dave Schultz died in the gravel of the driveway. By the accounts that surfaced later, he never spoke again after his brief greeting. His wife found him after she had called for help and returned outside. He was not yet dead when she reached him, but he was unresponsive. I want to pause here before continuing into the standoff and the arrest on what this scene looks like as it stands. What it looks like is the kind of event that comes from nowhere. A wealthy man in a Lincoln town car on a Friday afternoon drives into the driveway of his Olympic champion wrestling coach and shoots him 3 times in front of 2 witnesses for no apparent reason. The scene contains, in its surface form, no preparation. There is no build-up. There is no warning. There is, in the language of the period's local news coverage, no motive. The local news coverage was wrong. There was, by the time of the shooting, a documented decade of warning. There were people who had filed police reports. There were people who had been threatened in the same way Schultz had just been threatened. There were people who, in the months immediately preceding the shooting, had been cornered in the same wrestling weight room on the same estate by the same man with the same kind of weapon. The shooting on January 26, 1996, was the conclusion of a sequence that ran back, in the public record, to at least 1984. By the standards of the surrounding community, none of that had been visible. The local police did not consider the shooter a threat. The local press did not write about him as one. His family did not pursue commitment proceedings. The sport that depended on his money did not alert his family. The security consultant in the passenger seat of the Lincoln town car had been hired 3 years earlier, in part, to manage the behavior that had led to the wrestling weight room incident 4 months before the shooting. The behavior had not been managed. After the shooting, the driver of the Lincoln town car returned to the main residence. He locked himself inside. He told no one his intentions. He spoke, intermittently, by telephone with one of his attorneys, a lawyer named Taras Wochok. The standoff that began at approximately 2:45 in the afternoon on January 26th would last 48 hours. By Sunday afternoon, January 28th, the Delaware County District Attorney's Office, the local police, the Pennsylvania State Police, and the FBI had surrounded the mansion. They had not entered. The shooter had a substantial private armory inside the building. He had, by the accounts of people who had visited the mansion in the years preceding, more than one military-grade weapon. The police had no way to know which of those weapons he had with him in the interior rooms where he had taken refuge. They decided, after consultation between the local commanders and the FBI, not to assault the building. Instead, on Sunday afternoon, they shut off the boilers. They shut off the electrical power. The interior of the mansion on a January afternoon in southeastern Pennsylvania dropped from heated to ambient outdoor temperature within an hour. At a certain point, the shooter stepped out of the mansion to investigate the powerhouse and the generator. A Newtown Township police officer tackled him on the gravel walkway. He was arrested without a shot fired. By the time he was taken into custody, Dave Schultz had been dead for 46 hours. His body had been removed from the driveway by Friday evening. The Lincoln Town Car had been impounded. The revolver had been recovered inside the mansion, with the 3 spent rounds still in the cylinder. They had been disposed of by the shooter sometime between his return to the mansion on Friday afternoon and his arrest on Sunday afternoon. The prosecution would argue, at trial, that the disposal of the shell casings was evidence of consciousness of guilt. To understand how a silver Lincoln Town Car pulled up at 2:41 in the afternoon on January 26, 1996, the place to start is not Pennsylvania. It is not 1996. It is the bank of the Brandywine Creek in Delaware, in the summer of 1802. Chapter 2. Brandywine. Eleuthère Irénée DuPont was born in Paris in 1771. He was the second son of Pierre Samuel DuPont de Nemours, a French economist, minor noble, and friend of Turgot, Lavoisier, and Voltaire. The family was Huguenot. They were, by the standards of late 18th century French intellectual life, prominent without being aristocratic. Pierre Samuel had been ennobled by Louis XVI in 1784, an honor he had accepted partly for its political utility and partly, by his own letters, because he did not want to refuse the king to whom he owed certain personal favors. The younger son, by which I mean E.I., was apprenticed at the age of 16 to Antoine Laurent Lavoisier, then the head of the French Royal Saltpeter and Gunpowder Works at Essonne, 20 miles south of Paris. Lavoisier was, at that point, the most important practicing chemist in Europe. He is the figure now generally credited as the father of modern chemistry. His work on the conservation of mass, his correct identification of oxygen as the active component in combustion, his elimination of the phlogiston theory, and his systematic effort to rename the chemical elements according to a rational nomenclature, all date to the decade in which E.I. DuPont served under him. Lavoisier taught E.I., between the ages of 16 and 20, the chemistry and the manufacturing engineering of gunpowder production at industrial scale. Lavoisier was, 6 years after E.I. left Essonne, executed by guillotine on the 8th of May, 1794, on the same day as 27 other tax farmers and former officers of the French Ancien Régime. The DuPonts had supported the early phases of the French Revolution. They had also, in 1792, personally defended Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette from a mob at the Tuileries Palace. By the late 1790s, with the reign of terror behind them, but the revolutionary government still unstable, Pierre Samuel was sufficiently identified with the old regime that he was, on one specific occasion, scheduled for execution. He escaped, by accounts the family preserved, only because the political climate shifted overnight. He concluded that France was no longer a country in which the family could remain. They sailed for the United States in October of 1799. They arrived on January 1st, 1800. The date became, in the family's subsequent self-mythology, the founding anniversary. The DuPont family celebrates it still. E.I. DuPont was, at the time of the family's arrival, 29 years old. He had been trained in a specific industrial discipline. He had been trained by the foremost practitioner of that discipline in the world. He had observed, in the first years of his American residence, that the gunpowder produced by American manufacturers was, by the standards he had been taught at Essonne, of low quality. He concluded that there was a commercial opportunity. He proposed to his father and to his older brother Victor Marie that they capitalize a gunpowder manufacturing company. The act of association, forming what would be called E.I. DuPont de Nemours and Company, was signed in the spring of 1801. The initial capitalization was $36,000, raised through 18 shares at $2,000 each, sold primarily to French investors who had retained capital in their international holdings across the Revolutionary period. In the summer of 1802, E.I. purchased 95 acres on the Brandywine Creek, near Wilmington, Delaware, for $6,740. The site had two qualifying features. It had a steep enough drop in the creek to drive water-powered grinding mills. It had a substantial buffer of unoccupied woodland on the surrounding hillsides, useful for limiting the damage caused by the periodic explosions that any large-scale gunpowder operation would inevitably produce. He built the works, which he called the Eleutherian Mills, across the following 2 years. He imported the machinery from France. He recruited the foremen from former Essonne employees who had emigrated after the Revolution. The first powder was sold in the spring of 1804. The first year's production was 39,000 pounds. The second year more than tripled that. President Thomas Jefferson, who had known the DuPont family socially in Paris in the 1780s and who had corresponded with Pierre Samuel intermittently across the intervening 15 years, granted the new firm United States Army contracts for saltpeter and powder. The contracts were modest by the standards of the firm's subsequent military supply business, but they were, in 19th-century American manufacturing, foundational. A government contract opened access to private commercial buyers. The private commercial buyers included blasting operations for canal construction, road construction, and after 1845, the rapid expansion of American railroads. By the early 1840s, E.I. DuPont de Nemours and Company was, by manufacturing capacity, the largest single producer of black powder in the United States. The expansion arrived not just in scale, but in geography. In 1859, the company purchased a second powder works at Wapwallopen in Luzerne County in eastern Pennsylvania to serve the rapidly growing anthracite coal mining region. The Pennsylvania operation, by the standards of the surrounding industrial economy, was substantial in its own right. It would, across the second half of the 19th century, employ several hundred workers and supply a substantial portion of the blasting powder used in northeastern Pennsylvania coal extraction. The workforce at the original Brandywine mills had, by the 1840s, become a small and distinct community. The mill workers, called powdermen in the local vernacular, lived in company-built housing along the Brandywine Creek. The work was, by the standards of 19th-century American industrial labor, exceptionally dangerous. The Brandywine yards suffered an explosion, on average, approximately once every 14 months across the operating period from 1804 through the early 20th century. Each explosion killed, by the company's own records preserved at Hagley, between 2 and 40 workers. The Hagley archives still maintain the names of every powderman killed in a Brandywine explosion. The list runs to several hundred individuals across the operating life of the mills. E.I. DuPont's elder son, Alfred Victor DuPont, initially took over the management of the company on his father's death in 1834. Alfred Victor was 36 years old at his accession. He led the firm for the next decade and a half. He was succeeded by his younger brother, Henry DuPont, born 1812, around mid-century. Henry would, across the next several decades, expand the company through aggressive consolidation of competing American powder firms. He acquired smaller Eastern manufacturers whose entry into what would later be called the Powder Trust would eventually trigger the Sherman Act litigation of 1907. He was, by the time of his death in 1889, generally referred to inside the family and the trade press as the General, a title he had been awarded for his Civil War service as commanding officer of the Delaware Militia and his subsequent promotion to Brigadier General. I want to pause here on what it means to found a fortune on a single product. The American family fortunes that have lasted longest across the historical record are almost all built on a substance or a process that someone, somewhere, will always need. A railroad family needs continued continental commerce. A real estate family needs continued urban growth. A retail family needs continued consumer demand. The DuPont fortune was built on a substance that, by its nature, was needed in proportion to the scale of American extraction, American transportation construction, and American military procurement. All three of those scaled across the 19th century. The fortune scaled with them. By the time of the American Civil War, the question of which side would receive DuPont powder was no longer commercially open. The company was a northern firm, operating out of a slave-free state, with personal family ties to the federal government dating to the Jefferson administration. The firm sold, across the war years from 1861 through 1865, between 1/3 and 1/2 of all gunpowder consumed by the Union Army. The estimates vary depending on the source. The Encyclopedia of Greater Philadelphia cites approximately 1/3. The historical record at the Hagley Museum, which holds the firm's archives, cites a figure approaching 1/2. What is not disputed is that the company was, across the 4 years of the war, the dominant single supplier of explosives to one side in the largest American military conflict to that point. The Confederate side had no equivalent supplier. The Augusta Powder Works in Georgia, the principal southern facility, never reached the production scale of the Brandywine mills. The Confederate Army's chronic shortage of powder across the latter half of the war was, by the assessment of subsequent military historians, one of several material supply failures that contributed to the eventual Union victory. The Union Army, by contrast, was never short of powder. Whatever the Union commanders' frustrations with their logistics across the 4 years of the war, the failure of supply was almost never powder. The powder was, in every theater, available. E.I. DuPont himself did not live to see the war. He died on October 31, 1834, at the age of 63. The cause of death is disputed in the family records between cholera and a sudden cardiac event. The place of death is given variously in the surviving accounts as Philadelphia or as Eleutherian Mills, the family residence on the Brandywine. He was buried at the DuPont de Nemours Cemetery on the family property in Wilmington, where his great-great-grandson, the shooter from the previous chapter, would be buried 176 years later in a red Foxcatcher wrestling singlet. But the policy that would shape what the family became, more than the powder itself, was not made by E.I. DuPont. It was made, in 1810, by his father, in a letter that the family preserved. If you have made it this far, you should probably subscribe. It is free, and it is what keeps these coming. Chapter 3. the cousins. In 1810, Pierre Samuel DuPont de Nemours, the family patriarch, was 69 years old. He had survived the French Revolution by emigrating. He had reached, in the small Delaware community his sons were building around the Brandywine Works, what would have been, in the typology of late Enlightenment intellectual life, an old age second act. He had time. He had correspondence. He wrote, across his last decade, a long series of letters to his sons, his daughters-in-law, his French intellectual peers, and various French and American political contacts. The letters were preserved by the family because Pierre Samuel was, in the conventional understanding of the period, a substantial figure whose papers were worth keeping. In one of those letters, written in 1810 and surfaced by the British historian Leonard Mosley in his 1980 study of the family, Pierre Samuel set out his preference for how the next generation of the family should marry. He wrote that the marriages he should prefer for their colony in Delaware would be between the cousins. In that way, he wrote, they should be sure of honesty of soul and purity of blood. The phrase has been cited in the years since Mosley's book more often than any other from any of Pierre Samuel's letters. It is the closest the family ever came to producing a written policy document. The phrase has no force as a trust instrument or a corporate charter. There is no document, in the family or in the company archives, requiring cousin marriage. There is no estate provision that conditions inheritance on internal family alliance. There is, in 1810, only a letter from a 69-year-old patriarch to his family, expressing a preference. The preference was honored. 7 documented cousin marriages followed across the 3 generations after 1810. The number is from a 1993 Discover magazine article by the journalist Richard Conniff, drawing on the Hagley Museum's family genealogy records. The marriages were not concentrated in a single branch of the family. They occurred across the descendant lines of E.I. DuPont and his older brother Victor Marie, and they continued, in some lines, into the late 19th century. The first of the cousin marriages was the most prominent. Sophie Madeleine DuPont, daughter of E.I. DuPont and Sophie Dalmas, married her first cousin Samuel Francis DuPont in June of 1833. Samuel Francis was the son of Victor Marie, E.I.'s older brother. He would, across the next 4 decades, become one of the most distinguished officers of the United States Navy. He commanded the South Atlantic blockading squadron at the start of the Civil War. He led the Union Navy's first major amphibious operation, the seizure of Port Royal, South Carolina, in November of 1861. He retired with the rank of Rear Admiral. DuPont Circle in Washington is named for him. Sophie Madeleine, his wife, was simultaneously his first cousin and the daughter of his uncle. The marriage was, by every available account, affectionate. It was also, by the family's own self-understanding, an alliance of the kind the 1810 letter had recommended. Eugene DuPont, born 1840, married his second cousin Amelia Elizabeth DuPont in 1866. Eugene was, between 1889 and his death in 1902, the president of the company. William DuPont Sr., born 1855, married his cousin May Lamotte DuPont in 1878. They divorced in 1892, in one of the first major DuPont divorces. William DuPont Sr. would, across the years following the divorce, become a substantial thoroughbred horse breeder. His son, William DuPont Jr., was the father of the shooter from the first chapter. Alfred I DuPont, born 1864, married his cousin Bessie Gardner in 1887. He divorced her. He then, in 1907, married his recently divorced second cousin, Mary Alicia Hayward Bradford. The second marriage scandalized the broader family, partly because of the divorce, and partly because Mary Alicia was, even by the prevailing family standards, very close in degree of relation. There were others. Lamont DuPont, who was killed in a nitroglycerin explosion at the Rapauno Works in 1884 at the age of 52, was himself descended from a Lamont DuPont marriage in the previous generation. The Boleyn family, into which several DuPonts married, was itself partly DuPont through earlier alliances. The Mary Alicia Hayward Bradford marriage was the last of the documented cousin matches. The practice tapered after the turn of the 20th century, as the family grew large enough that endogamy was no longer practically necessary to keep wealth concentrated. The mechanism by which the family preserved this concentration deserves its own description, because it operated through a structure that was, by the standards of 19th century American business, unusual. The company was, from its founding in 1802 until its reorganization in 1902, managed by a small group of senior family members operating in concert. The group was, in the daily language of the family, called the Family Council. Membership in the council was hereditary and indirect. It depended on a combination of seniority, demonstrated competence at the firm, and the assent of the existing council members. The council met in the principal Wilmington residences of its members. Its decisions on questions of capital expenditure, acquisition, hiring, dividend distribution, and family marriages were generally unanimous. The unanimous requirement was not formal. It was a function of the small size of the council and the social cost of internal dissent. In 1902, the family was confronted with the death of Eugene DuPont, the company president, in May of that year. Several of the other senior managing partners had also been seriously ill in the preceding period. The remaining senior family members initially proposed to sell the company to outside interests. The asking price was approximately $12 million. The proposed buyer was a competing American powder consolidator. Three younger cousins intervened. They were Thomas Coleman DuPont, Alfred I DuPont, and Pierre Samuel DuPont II, generally known in the family as Pierre S. They were, respectively, approximately 38, 37, and 32 years old in 1902. They had been working in the firm in junior management positions. They proposed, instead of the external sale, that the three of them would buy the company themselves, with payment structured over time from the company's own future earnings. The senior generation accepted the proposal. The three cousins formally took control in early 1902. The arrangement, in the language of the period's corporate finance, was a leveraged buyout. In the language of the family, it was a generational transfer of operating control. The three cousins, across the following decade, consolidated the company's structure, made the major acquisitions that triggered the 1907 antitrust suit, and oversaw the spin-offs that resulted from the 1912 court ruling. They also fell out with each other. By 1915, Alfred I DuPont had been removed from the company's day-to-day operations in a dispute with Pierre S. over share allocations and management succession. The dispute resulted in litigation that ran for several years and reached the federal appellate courts. The relationships were never repaired. The three cousins, who had, in 1902, prevented the company from being sold to outsiders, died, across the following several decades, in mutual estrangement. The family was, by 1920, no longer the small, consolidated group of cousins it had been at the start of the century. It was a network of competing branches, each with its own holding companies, real estate interests, and downstream investments. The wealth had been kept inside the surname. the unity of decision-making had not. I want to pause here on the strange, double character of the 19th century family. By the standards of 19th century American business culture, the DuPonts were structurally forward-looking. They opened corporate governance to women decades before most of the rest of the country. Women, including the daughters and the widows, attended the family council that made strategic decisions about the company. They voted in those meetings. Their financial interests were treated, within the family's internal accounting, as roughly equivalent to the men's. By the standards of the 19th century, this is a remarkable feature of the family's structure. Most large American family-controlled businesses of the period treated women as beneficiaries to be provided for, not as voting principals. By the standards of 19th century American marriage culture, however, the family was, in the same period, medieval. The marriages were arranged inward. The blood was kept inside the colony. In Pierre Samuel's phrase, the land was passed from cousin to cousin in patterns that had more in common with 13th century European royal houses than with the surrounding Delaware professional middle class. Both choices, the corporate forwardness and the matrimonial backwardness, served the same end: concentration. The wealth, both in the company and in the surrounding real estate and personal holdings, was kept inside the family. The mechanisms for keeping it inside were, depending on the question, either innovative or atavistic. The function was identical. A later commentator, the historian Mark Duke, summarized the family's 19th century practice with a single observation. The DuPonts, he wrote, did not marry the daughters of other industrial dynasties because they had nothing to gain from doing so. The wealth was already inside. The marriages were a way of holding it there. I want to add, before moving on, a hard ground rule about how to read the cousin marriage thread across the rest of this story. The thread belongs to the 19th century. It belongs to a family that was deciding, generation by generation, how to keep an industrial fortune from leaving the household. It does not, by any responsible reading of the genetic literature, explain what happened to John DuPont in his 50s. John DuPont's parents were not cousins. His mother was a Baldwin Locomotive Works heiress from a different industrial family entirely. The cousin marriages in his family tree run back, on his father's side, to his great-grandfather, William DuPont Sr., 2 full generations removed from his own conception. The clinical literature on schizophrenia is clear that the disorder is polygenic, environmentally modulated, and not in any meaningful sense the consequence of a 19th century policy of internal alliance. I mention the family's marriage history in this chapter because it is documented, and because it explains the corporate continuity that funded everything that came after. I do not mention it as a diagnosis. The diagnosis comes later. It belongs to John alone. While the family was consolidating its blood, the company was preparing for the century that would, more than any other, make DuPont one of the most consequential industrial firms in American history. That century began with a federal antitrust case. Chapter 4. Powder. In 1907, the United States Department of Justice filed an antitrust suit against E.I. DuPont de Nemours and Company under the Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890. The case was the first major federal antitrust action against a single industrial firm since the breakup of the Standard Oil Company in 1906. The grounds were straightforward. DuPont controlled, by the Department of Justice's own assessment, roughly 2/3 of the American explosives market. It had achieved that share through a combination of organic growth, predatory pricing against smaller rivals, and the systematic acquisition of competing firms. The trade press of the period referred to the consolidated industry as the Powder Trust. The case worked its way through the federal courts for 5 years. In 1912, the United States District Court for the District of Delaware ruled against DuPont. The remedy ordered was structural. The court required the firm to spin off two new corporations, each operating independently, each with its own management and shareholding base. The spin-offs were the Hercules Powder Company, incorporated in 1912, and the Atlas Powder Company, incorporated in October of 1913. DuPont retained, after the spin-offs, approximately the same physical Brandywine and surrounding production capacity it had operated before the case. But it no longer controlled the American explosives industry as a single corporate structure. The Sherman Act ruling was, by the standards of the firm's subsequent history, a near miss. The remedy was less severe than the Standard Oil breakup. DuPont remained, after 1913, the single largest American producer of military and industrial explosives. Within 18 months of the spin-off completion, the company would be operating at a scale no court order would interrupt. The First World War began in August of 1914. The Allied powers, particularly Britain and France, lacked the industrial chemistry capacity to supply their own armies with smokeless powder, dynamite, and the related explosives compounds needed for sustained European trench warfare. They turned, almost from the opening months of the war, to American suppliers. DuPont was, by 1915, by a substantial margin, the largest American supplier capable of operating at the scale the Allied procurement programs required. The company spent the war years building production at a pace it had never attempted before. In 1915 and 1916, it took on contracts that required, in some cases, the construction of entirely new plant infrastructure dedicated to single product lines. The most consequential of these was the Old Hickory plant outside Nashville, Tennessee, built under United States government contract and operated by DuPont as a wartime smokeless powder facility. Across the 4 years of the war, the company produced, on its consolidated American facilities, approximately 40% of the Allied forces' total explosives. The figure of 1.5 billion pounds of explosives produced for the Allies between 1914 and 1918 is from a 2014 oral history interview given by Irene DuPont Jr. to the Atomic Heritage Foundation. The figure includes both the smokeless propellants and the higher explosives produced under the various war contracts. The First World War was the company's first scale-up. The Second World War was its second. Across the years from 1941 to 1945, DuPont produced billions of pounds of smokeless propellants for the United States military and the Allied forces. The total production substantially exceeded the First World War figure. The exact aggregate figure varies across the surviving corporate and government records. The company also took on, in the same period, contracts that were not, in the public press of the period, attributable to DuPont in any visible way. The largest of these was the construction and operation of the Hanford Engineer Works in eastern Washington state between 1943 and 1945. Hanford was the plutonium production facility of the Manhattan Project. DuPont operated it under a federal contract structured to charge the company $1 in profit, plus reimbursement of all operating costs. The company took the contract. By Irene DuPont Jr.'s account in the same Atomic Heritage interview, partly out of patriotic obligation and partly because the alternative was that no major American chemical firm would. The work was technically extraordinary. The first nuclear reactors operated for industrial purposes in human history were the Hanford piles. The plutonium that produced the Trinity test in July of 1945 and the Nagasaki bomb in August of that year was processed at Hanford under DuPont's direct supervision. Across the same century, the company's chemists produced a series of consumer inventions that by the second half of the 20th century had become foundational features of American material culture. Wallace Carruthers, a research chemist at DuPont's experimental station outside Wilmington, first synthesized the nylon polymer in 1935. Commercial production of nylon began in 1938. Roy Plunkett, also at the experimental station, accidentally discovered polytetrafluoroethylene, later trademarked as Teflon, in 1938. Neoprene, the synthetic rubber, was developed by DuPont in 1930. Freon, the refrigerant gas, was developed by DuPont in the same year. Across the following decades came Lucite, Mylar, Lycra, Tyvek, Kapton, and Kevlar. By the 1970s, the consumer-facing portion of the company's product line was, in cumulative cultural footprint, comparable to the military-facing portion. The advertising slogan introduced in 1935, "Better Living Through Chemistry," captured the framing the company itself preferred. In 1917, the company began acquiring shares of General Motors. By the late 1950s, after several decades of accumulation and intra-corporate exchange, the holding had grown to approximately 23% of General Motors' outstanding stock. The United States Supreme Court ruled in 1957 that the holding constituted an antitrust violation under the Clayton Act, on the grounds that DuPont's chemical business gave it preferential supply access to the automotive industry through the GM stake. The court ordered divestiture. The divestiture took 8 years to complete, concluding in 1965. It remains the largest corporate divestiture in American history after the Standard Oil breakup. The pattern across the company's 20th century was, structurally, the same as the pattern across its 19th century. The company would scale into a major contract opportunity, dominate the resulting market, attract antitrust attention, undergo a forced divestiture, and emerge from the divestiture still substantially larger than any of its surviving competitors. The Sherman Act case of 1907 produced the Hercules spin-off in 1912 and the Atlas spin-off in 1913. The Clayton Act case of 1957 produced the 8-year General Motors divestiture, concluding in 1965. Each cycle, the company emerged smaller in market share than it had been at the peak, and substantially larger in absolute revenue than it had been at the trough. By the 1970s, the company's consumer-facing brands had developed an identifying recognition in American household culture comparable to the recognition of a small number of other 20th-century industrial firms. The Teflon-coated frying pan in an American kitchen was in nearly every case the product of DuPont chemistry. The nylon stocking in the dresser drawer was similarly traceable. The Mylar packaging on the food in the refrigerator was developed in the company's experimental station outside Wilmington. The Kevlar fabric in the body armor worn by American police departments after the late 1970s was a DuPont invention, licensed and manufactured under DuPont patents until the patents expired. I want to pause here on what this kind of accumulated material presence does to a family's political position. A family that, across 3 generations, has placed its industrial outputs into virtually every American household at virtually every consumption level is, in the political sociology of the period, no longer a private family. It is a public institution. Its decisions about contributions, about endorsements, about whom to support in primary contests are read by the political press as institutional decisions rather than as individual ones. The family's preferences become, in effect, market signals. Across the second half of the 20th century, the surviving senior members of the family were, by every available account, conservative Republicans of the Northeastern establishment variety. Their political donations followed that orientation. The Republican primary candidates who received DuPont's support were, with rare exceptions, the moderate establishment figures of the party's mid-century formation. Two members of the family served as United States Senators from Delaware during the same period. Henry Algernon DuPont, generally known as Colonel Henry for his Civil War rank, sat in the Senate as a Republican from June of 1906 to March of 1917. He held the Medal of Honor for his battlefield conduct at Cedar Creek in 1864. His cousin, Thomas Coleman DuPont, generally called T. Coleman, served two non-consecutive Senate terms between 1921 and 1928. T. Coleman had also been the company's president from 1902 to 1915. In the later 20th century, Pierre Samuel DuPont IV, generally called Pete, served 3 terms in the United States House of Representatives from 1971 to 1977, then 2 terms as the 68th Governor of Delaware from 1977 to 1985, then ran for the 1988 Republican presidential nomination on a platform that emphasized welfare reform and tax cuts. He did not win the nomination. He retired to the practice of law in Wilmington. The combined family fortune, by 2016, was estimated by Forbes at approximately $14.3 billion, distributed across more than 3,500 living relatives. I want to pause here on what a fortune of this kind does to a household. A modestly wealthy family produces, in any given generation, a small number of children who are conscious that their lives are easier than the lives of the people around them. A wealthy family produces children who are aware of the disparity, but for whom the disparity is essentially invisible inside the home, since the home itself is the disparity. A family that has produced 2 senators, a governor, 3 company presidents, and several dozen national-level cultural and philanthropic figures across 6 generations produces children of a different kind. Those children grow up understanding that their last name is, in itself, an institution. They grow up with staff. They grow up with land. They grow up with chemistry that goes by their grandfather's first initials. They grow up with the assumption that the world, as a structural matter, exists to accommodate them. Some of those children handle the assumption well. They become senators or governors or chemists or museum founders or philanthropists. Some of them handle it badly. They become eccentrics. A small number of them, across the historical span of large American family fortunes, become dangerous. The danger is not, by any honest reading, caused by the wealth. The danger is caused by what the wealth makes it possible to ignore. People around a wealthy individual learn, over time, that there are certain behaviors of his they are paid to manage rather than to escalate. The behaviors do not get reported, they get worked around. The longer the working around continues, the harder it becomes to introduce the kind of intervention that would, in a household without the wealth, have happened naturally. The household that produced the heir at the center of this story was not the corporate one in Wilmington. It was a household 90 miles north of Wilmington in Newtown Square, Pennsylvania, on land that had been a wedding gift. Hit subscribe if you want the next one. Costs nothing. Takes a second. Chapter 5. Lysander Hall. The estate at Newtown Square was, in 1919, a working dairy and racing operation set on more than 600 acres of rolling pasture south of the Philadelphia main line. The land had been part of the Austin family's holdings for 2 generations. William Lysander Austin, the president of the Baldwin Locomotive Works, owned the parcel outright. On January 1, 1919, his daughter Jean Lyciter Austin married William DuPont, Jr., the son of the thoroughbred breeder William DuPont, Sr. The wedding was reported in the Philadelphia and New York Society pages as the wedding of the century. The phrase was, by the conventions of the period's society reporting, applied to roughly one wedding every 5 years. The Austin-DuPont marriage qualified because it joined the heir to one of the largest American industrial fortunes to the daughter of one of the largest American railroad equipment fortunes. William Lyciter Austin gave the couple the parcel as a wedding gift. William DuPont Sr., the groom's father, then commissioned on the parcel the construction of a 3-story Georgian manor house, modeled in significant part on James Madison's Montpelier in Virginia. The construction was completed in 1922. The house was called Lyciter Hall, after the Austin family. The estate operated across the next several decades as both a working farm and a racing complex. The farm portion ran a substantial Guernsey dairy herd. The racing portion was anchored by William DuPont Jr.'s thoroughbred stable, which he named Foxcatcher Farm after his fox hunting interests. The thoroughbreds raced in the colors of Foxcatcher. The Guernseys produced dairy. The pony breeding operation, which Jean Austin DuPont personally directed, produced Welsh ponies that dominated the Devon Horse Show in suburban Philadelphia for nearly 50 consecutive years. William DuPont Jr. was, by the standards of American horse racing in the period between the 2 world wars, one of the consequential owner-breeders of his generation. He raced under colors that became, across his lifetime, one of the recognizable identifying marks of the Eastern American racing establishment. The Foxcatcher horses ran competitively at Pimlico, at Belmont Park, at Saratoga, and at the other major Eastern American tracks across the middle decades of the 20th century. He bred several horses that placed in the major American classics, although none of his runners ever won the Triple Crown. He maintained subsidiary breeding operations in Maryland that, after his second marriage in 1948, became the principal residences of his second family. He was also, in the same period, an active amateur sportsman. He played squash and tennis. He maintained, on the Foxcatcher estate, a substantial private squash court and a tennis court. The tennis court would, after his second marriage in November of 1947 to the American tennis champion Margaret Osborne, become the principal training court for her continued competitive career. Margaret Osborne DuPont was, at the time of their marriage, the reigning U.S. National Championships singles champion, and was ranked, at her peak, as the top women's player in the world. William DuPont Jr. and Jean Lyciter Austin had 4 children across the years from 1923 to 1938. Their eldest, Jean Ellen, was born 1923. Their second, Evelyn Rebecca, was born 1925. Their third, originally named William Henry DuPont III, and later legally renamed Henry Eleuthère Irénée, was born 1927. Their fourth and youngest, John Eleuthère, was born on November 22, 1938, in Philadelphia. By the time the youngest child was 3 years old, the marriage had ended. William DuPont Jr. and Jean divorced in 1941. The terms of the separation were unusual for the period in one important respect. Jean retained the estate. The 242-acre parcel that had been her father's wedding gift, the manor house built on it, and the working operations established within it, all stayed under her control. William DuPont Jr. moved out. He remarried, in 1948, the American tennis champion Margaret Osborne, and had with her a 5th child, William DuPont III, John's half-brother. Jean Lyciter Austin DuPont retained the estate for the next 47 years. She ran it until her death in August of 1988. I want to pause here on what she was like, because the dossier on John DuPont's later decline is, at every available angle, structured around her. By the accounts of her surviving children, her in-laws, her staff, and the wrestlers who later met her briefly when they came to Foxcatcher to train, Jean was a remote figure. She was tall, formal, exacting, and emotionally distant. She presented in her daily conduct the manner of a Gilded Age matriarch who had outlived the period to which her manners belonged. She regarded the Austin and the DuPont families as the upper edge of American society. She regarded her social peers in the surrounding Newtown Square community as functionally beneath her. She delegated, by every available account, the daily care of her children to estate staff. One of those staff members, a man known on the property as Mr. Cherry, was the closest adult presence in young John DuPont's daily life across his early years. She regarded wrestling, when her youngest son took it up as an adult avocation in the early 1980s, as the sport of what she called ruffians. She did not attend the wrestling competitions he hosted at her estate. She did not visit the training center he built. By the accounts of the wrestlers who lived at Foxcatcher in the years before her death, she barely acknowledged that the wrestling program existed. Subsequent biographical accounts of John DuPont's adult life, drawing on extensive interviews with surviving family members and Foxcatcher staff, described Jean's relationship with her youngest son in language the family did not contest. She had, by those accounts, instilled in him from his earliest years a clear understanding of his place on the food chain. The place was at the top. She had also, in the same period, withheld the kind of warm, maternal contact that, in most other American families of the period, was understood as standard. John DuPont grew up with two propositions simultaneously installed in him by his mother. He was at the apex of American society. He was also, in the moment-to-moment of his daily early childhood, alone. He was the youngest of four. His older siblings, born across the 18 years preceding his birth, had moved out of the house or were close to moving out by the time he was conscious of his surroundings. The estate was, by the time he was 5 or 6, his and Jean's and the staff's. The staff did the daily work of raising him. Jean made the strategic decisions. The relationship between mother and youngest son was, by every available account, the singular emotional axis of John's adult life. Her death in August of 1988 would, by the unanimous assessment of the psychiatric experts who later evaluated him, mark the beginning of his decompensation into paranoid schizophrenia. In the meantime, across the half-century between the youngest child's birth and Jean's death, the estate operated. The Guernseys were milked twice a day, the ponies were bred, the roses in the formal garden planted in the late 1920s were maintained. The estate workers were paid, the house was kept. The mother and the youngest child lived, increasingly across the 1970s and into the early 1980s, in separate residences on the property. John was, by the time he was in his late 30s, living in a smaller house several hundred yards from Lissitor Hall. He did not move back into the main house until the days following his mother's death. The three older siblings lived adult lives largely separate from John's. Jean, the eldest, would marry, divorce, and remarry across her adult life. Her second husband was a prominent publisher. She would, in her own right, become a substantial thoroughbred breeder. Evelyn, the second daughter, raised her family in the suburban Philadelphia community after marrying John H. Donaldson, Jr. Henry, the older son, pursued a career in agricultural and thoroughbred operations distinct from his father's. None of them lived on the Foxcatcher estate after their early adulthood. None of them had daily contact with John across his adult years. His half-brother William III, born to William DuPont Jr. and Margaret Osborne in 1952 when John was 13, was raised at his father's second residence in Maryland, and did not, in the conventional sense, share a household with John. The two children of the two marriages met intermittently at family events. They were not, in any normal sense, brothers. William III would, across his adult life, focus on the Maryland thoroughbred operations his father had established and on his own competitive squash career, and would, by the time of John's eventual incarceration, have minimal contact with him. John attended, intermittently, the Haverford School in suburban Philadelphia for portions of his secondary schooling. He did not complete a conventional educational sequence at any single institution. His mother had concluded, by his middle teens, that the formal school environment did not suit him. He returned, between the school enrollments, to the estate. He worked with the estate staff on the bird collection. He developed, by his 15th or 16th year, a routine of solitary expeditions across the surrounding Newtown Square countryside, returning with specimens for the cabinets. The next chapter is his. Chapter 6. Eagle. A man in a dark suit sits in a wood-paneled auction gallery on Madison Avenue in New York on an afternoon in early April of 1980. He is 41 years old. He is driven up from Newtown Square that morning. He is holding a numbered bidder's paddle. The lot opening in front of him is a single postage stamp, octagonal, magenta, slightly worn at the corners, printed in 1856 in the British colony of Guyana for a temporary postal shortage and never reissued. There is exactly one known surviving copy. The opening bid is $200,000. The bidding closes, 20 minutes later, at $935,000. The man with the paddle has bought the stamp. He has bid through an intermediary at Robert A. Siegel Auction Galleries, but the philatelic trade press will identify him within 48 hours. His name is John Eleuthère DuPont. He is the youngest of Jean Lysander Austin DuPont's 4 children. He has, in 1980, just spent $935,000 on a 1-cent stamp. The price is the highest ever paid for a single piece of philately to that date. It will hold the record intermittently across the next 34 years. John DuPont, in 1980, is what the surrounding Pennsylvania community calls eccentric. The label is generous. The label is also incomplete. The behaviors he is exhibiting in 1980 are the behaviors of a wealthy collector with a flair for self-presentation. They have not, at this point, crossed the threshold into anything a reasonable observer would call menacing. That threshold is approximately 8 years in the future. What he is, in 1980, is the inheritor of an industrial fortune who has spent most of his adult life looking for an identity that the fortune did not, by its mere existence, provide. He was born on November 22, 1938, in Philadelphia, the 4th child of William DuPont Jr. and Jean Lysander Austin DuPont. His 3 older siblings, Jean, Evelyn, and Henry, were 15, 13, and 11 years old at the time of his birth. He grew up effectively alone on the Newtown Square estate. His parents divorced when he was 3. His father remarried. His mother retained the property and the operations. The estate staff raised him in the daily sense. His mother set the tone. He developed, in his middle teens, an interest in birds. The interest was not casual. By the age of 15, he was collecting bird skins. By the age of 17, he was assembling, in a series of cabinets on the estate, what was already a substantial private specimen collection by the standards of American amateur ornithology. By the late 1950s, the collection had grown beyond what the estate could comfortably house. In 1957, At the age of 19, he incorporated, with his mother's financial backing, the Delaware Museum of Natural History. The museum was not, in 1957, a building. It was a non-profit charter that would, 15 years later in 1972, open a permanent exhibition facility outside Wilmington. The museum's founding collection was his bird skins. The birdskin collection ultimately reached approximately 66,000 specimens. It is, by the assessment of professional ornithologists who have examined it, one of the largest privately assembled birdskin collections of the 20th century. The Delaware Museum still holds it, although the institution itself was renamed in 2017. He attended the University of Pennsylvania briefly in 1957, withdrawing before completing his freshman year. He subsequently attended the University of Miami in Florida, eventually completing a Bachelor of Science degree there in 1965. He returned to the Newtown Square estate. He continued the bird collecting. He took up in the early 1960s the modern pentathlon as an adult competitive avocation. Modern pentathlon, the Olympic event combining pistol shooting, fencing, swimming, equestrian show jumping, and cross-country running, was an unusual choice for a man in his middle 20s to start training in for the first time. The standard pentathlete profile, in the 1960s as today, was a former military officer or career athlete who had been training in 3 or 4 of the 5 disciplines from adolescence. John DuPont had been training in approximately none of them. He took up all 5 at once with private coaching paid for by his trust accounts. He competed at the national level. He did not place near the top. He did not qualify for the Olympic Games as a competitor. He did, by the early 1970s, become substantially involved in the administration of American pentathlon at the national level. In 1976, at the Montreal Games, he served as the manager of the United States Olympic Modern Pentathlon team. The team finished out of medal contention. The Soviet Union, dominant in pentathlon across the 1960s and 70s, took the gold. The pentathlon involvement is significant for one reason that becomes important later. It established, for the first time in John DuPont's life, a public identity built around athletic administrative leadership. He was not, in the period from approximately 1965 through 1976, a bird collector or a stamp collector or a museum founder, although he was all of those things. He was a sports administrator. He was, in his own self-description across the years that followed, a coach. In 1983, at the age of 44, he married a physical therapist named Gail Wenck. The marriage lasted approximately 10 months in cohabitation. They separated in early 1984. The divorce was finalized in 1987. By Wenck's account, in subsequent civil filings, John DuPont's behavior in the marriage had been characterized by paranoia, mood swings, and at one point an episode in which he had, by her testimony, pushed her into a fireplace at the Newtown Square house. The episode did not result, at the time, in criminal charges. It was, by every available account, the first documented instance of physical violence in John DuPont's adult biography. He did not marry again. He continued to collect. He continued to manage. He began, in the late 1970s and accelerating through the 1980s, to acquire honorary law enforcement credentials. He was appointed honorary deputy sheriff of Delaware County. He was given, by various local police departments to which he made substantial equipment donations, badges, uniforms, and on at least one documented occasion, an armored personnel carrier of military specification. The armored vehicle was, by the testimony of multiple Foxcatcher staff members across the late 1980s and early 1990s, occasionally driven by him on the estate roads. He took, in the same period, an interest in another sport, wrestling. He had not, in his earlier athletic period, trained in it. He took it up, by his own later statements, because he believed wrestling was a sport in which the United States could plausibly contend with the Soviet Union, and because the existing American Wrestling Federation was, in his assessment, underfunded. I want to pause here on what wealth at this scale does to identity, because it is the structural fact underneath the rest of John DuPont's adult life. Most people, when they exhibit unusual interests, find the boundaries of those interests imposed by external constraints. They cannot collect 66,000 bird skins because no one will sell them 66,000 bird skins on a school teacher's salary. They cannot bid on the British Guiana 1-cent magenta because they do not have $935,000 to bid. They cannot decide, in middle age, to take up an Olympic discipline they have never trained in, because they do not have the discretionary time or the private coaching budget. The boundaries that the rest of the world treats as the natural limits of identity, the things you cannot do because you are not a particular kind of person, do not exist for someone in John DuPont's financial position. He could be, at any given moment, whatever he chose to be. The pentathlon period made him a sports administrator. The stamp acquisition made him a major philatelist. The bird collecting made him the founder of a museum. The badges made him a law enforcement honorary. None of these identities was earned in the ordinary sense. All of them were purchased. And because they were purchased, none of them was permanent in the way that identities built through work and competition tend to be permanent. He could shed any of them at any time. He did, repeatedly, across the 1970s and 80s, shed and acquire new identities at a pace that, in another person, would have looked like a crisis. In him, it looked like wealth. The transition into the wrestling identity was, by the standards of his prior transitions, gradual. He began attending USA wrestling events in the early 1980s. He began making donations. He began by the middle of the decade making donations of a scale that the Federation had not previously received from any single individual. Between 1987 and 1995, his contributions to USA Wrestling exceeded $3 million. He was, by the late 1980s, the single largest individual sponsor in the history of American amateur wrestling. The donations bought him a degree of access to the sport that the sport's professional administrators were uncertain how to manage. He was given the title of head coach of the Foxcatcher National Training Center, the wrestling facility he had built on his estate. He was given an honorary coaching position with the USA Wrestling National Team. He was, by his own letterhead and by some of the Federation's communications, addressed as Coach DuPont. He had not, in his life to that point, ever wrestled competitively. He had no certification. He had no experience as an assistant. He had, in the words of the wrestlers who would later live on his estate, the title because he had paid for the title. The next chapter is what the wrestlers found when they arrived. If you are still here, subscribe. That is what keeps these going. Chapter 7. Foxcatcher. Mark Schultz was 25 years old when he arrived at Foxcatcher Farm in the late spring of 1986. He was Dave Schultz's younger brother by 17 months. He had, like his older brother, been an NCAA champion. He had won 3 consecutive NCAA titles at the University of Oklahoma between 1981 and 1983, at 167 pounds and 177 pounds. He had won the Olympic gold medal at 82 kilograms in the Los Angeles Games of 1984, in the same Olympic tournament in which his older brother won at 74. He was, between 1983 and 1987, one of the top American freestyle wrestlers at his weight class. He arrived at Foxcatcher because John DuPont had recruited him. DuPont had built, by 1986, the first iteration of what would become the Foxcatcher National Training Center. The facility was a converted barn on the estate, fitted with regulation mats, weight training equipment, and a wrestling-specific cardiovascular setup that, by the standards of American amateur wrestling in the middle 1980s, was substantially better than anything available at a typical university program or at the USA Wrestling National Training Site in Colorado Springs. The training center existed because John DuPont had decided it should exist. The training center continued to operate because John DuPont continued to fund it. The arrangement offered, for an American freestyle wrestler in 1986, an unprecedented set of resources. Wrestlers who came to Foxcatcher were given a stipend. They were given housing on the property, either in the converted estate buildings or in apartments DuPont owned in the surrounding township. They were given access to the training facility on a schedule they themselves designed. They were given travel funding to the international competitions that had previously been, for most American freestyle wrestlers, financed out of personal credit cards or family support. They were given access to professional coaches, who themselves were paid out of DuPont's foundation accounts. They were given medical care, physical therapy, and at one point, a sports psychology consultation program that was, by the standards of 1980s American amateur athletics, unusually well-resourced. The arrangement was, in the language of American amateur sport in the mid-1980s, unique. No other private patron had, to that point, financed an Olympic-level training program of comparable scale outside the official Olympic Committee structure. The Federation, USA Wrestling, was uncertain at first how to integrate the offering into its existing development pipeline. By 1987, the integration had been formalized. Foxcatcher became, in effect, a parallel training site for the national team. Wrestlers could train at Colorado Springs or at Foxcatcher or at both. The Federation's central administrative offices acknowledged Foxcatcher as an official partner. DuPont was added as honorary national coach to several Federation publications. I want to pause here on what the offer looked like from the wrestlers' side. American freestyle wrestlers in the 1980s were, by the conventions of their sport, post-college amateurs in a discipline that had, in the United States, almost no commercial structure outside the National Collegiate Athletic Association. After graduation, the funding for continued international competition came from the wrestlers themselves, from their families, from intermittent national team stipends that were modest by any reasonable comparison, and from coaching jobs at universities that paid them to coach other people's careers rather than their own. The career trajectory was bounded, in nearly every documented case, by economic constraint. Wrestlers ranked in the top 3 nationally at 26 were often working second jobs to pay rent. International travel for the World Championships and the World Cup was, for many of them, contingent on individual fundraising. What Foxcatcher offered them was the removal of that constraint. They could, for the first time in the modern history of American freestyle wrestling, train as full-time professionals. The price of the removal was that they had to accept John DuPont's presence in the training facility and in the daily life of the estate. The price did not, in the perception of most of the wrestlers who accepted the offer in the early years, seem unreasonable. DuPont was, in 1986, eccentric but not obviously menacing. He attended practices. He occasionally stepped onto the mat to demonstrate techniques he had read about in books. The technique demonstrations were, by the unanimous later testimony of the wrestlers who saw them, of approximately the level one would expect from a 48-year-old man who had never wrestled competitively. The wrestlers, when DuPont was present, paid him polite attention. When he left the facility, they resumed their training under the coaches he had hired to do the actual coaching. The coaches he hired were, by every available account, professionally qualified. The first head coach of the training facility was a former USA Wrestling national team coach. Later head coaches included Dave Schultz himself from 1989 until his death, and a small staff of assistant coaches who served across multiple seasons. The actual technical instruction at Foxcatcher was, by professional standards, competent. The technical instruction was not the source of the problem. The problem was John DuPont's role. He insisted on being addressed, in the facility and in correspondence, as Coach DuPont. He had business cards printed with the title. He maintained, on the wall of the office adjacent to the wrestling mats, framed photographs of himself in coaching contexts that, in some cases, had been staged for the photographs. He instructed wrestlers on occasion to perform exercises he had personally designed. The exercises were, by the later assessment of the professional coaches who saw them, sometimes mildly counterproductive, but not dangerous. The wrestlers performed them when DuPont was watching and did not perform them otherwise. He sometimes stepped onto the mat himself, in a singlet, to roll with the wrestlers. The rolling was, by the wrestlers' accounts, gentle on their part and uncoordinated on his. They did not injure him. They did not allow him to feel that he had been let win, since he was sensitive to that perception. They held themselves to a standard of athletic theater that, for the kind of resources he was providing them, they considered an acceptable cost. Mark Schultz lived at Foxcatcher from the spring of 1986 until the summer of 1988. He left, by his own subsequent account in his 2014 autobiography, Foxcatcher, because the relationship with DuPont had become, by his interpretation of the events of those 2 years, untenable for reasons he documented in the book and which subsequent reviewers have variously characterized. The detail of the dispute is reserved for a later chapter. What matters for the timeline of this one is that Mark Schultz, who was the first major Olympic-level wrestler to live full-time at Foxcatcher, left after 2 years. He returned intermittently for visits and for specific training cycles. He did not move back to the estate permanently. His older brother arrived in 1989. Dave Schultz brought Nancy and the 2 children. He moved into the farmhouse on Goshen Road, the same farmhouse described in the first chapter of this story. He became, in 1989, the head coach of the Foxcatcher Wrestling Center. He coached, across the following 7 years, a substantial percentage of the American freestyle wrestlers who medaled at the World Championships and the Olympics during that span. He recruited, retained, and developed the wrestlers who would, in 1996, form the American Olympic team competing in Atlanta. The wrestlers who lived at Foxcatcher between 1989 and 1996 included Kevin Jackson, who would win Olympic gold at 82 kilograms in Barcelona in 1992. They included Kenny Monday, the 1988 Olympic gold medalist at 74 kilograms, who trained at Foxcatcher in the early 1990s before moving on. They included Royce Alger and, beginning in the early 1990s, the Bulgarian freestyle wrestler Valentin Yordanov. Yordanov is worth introducing in this chapter because his presence becomes important to the end of the story. He was, in 1990, the reigning world champion at 52 kilograms. He would, by the time he retired in the late 1990s, hold 10 world championship medals and an Olympic gold medal, won in the Atlanta Games of 1996. He was, by international consensus, one of the greatest lightweight freestyle wrestlers in the history of the sport. He moved to Foxcatcher in the early 1990s, accepted full-time residence on the estate, and trained there alongside the American wrestlers. He spoke English imperfectly. He was, by every available account, scrupulously polite to John DuPont. He observed in the years that followed the behaviors that became progressively more unusual. The wrestlers who lived at Foxcatcher between 1986 and 1996 were not, in the conventional sense, employees. They were not paid salaries with W-2 forms. They were, in the legal structure DuPont's attorneys had set up, recipients of charitable training grants from the Foxcatcher Foundation. The structure had tax advantages. It also had a structural consequence. The wrestlers had, in their relationship with DuPont, the status of beneficiaries. They were grateful in the form their gratitude was expected to take. They were, by the conventions of the relationship, not in a position to escalate concerns about their patron's behavior to anyone who could meaningfully act on them. I want to be careful here about the timing. The behaviors at Foxcatcher that, in retrospect, were warning signs of John DuPont's developing illness were not, in the first half of the period covered by this chapter, severe. Through 1986, 1987, and most of 1988, DuPont was eccentric in the way wealthy patrons sometimes are. He wanted to be addressed as a coach. He wanted his photograph taken. He wanted to feel that the program was his. The wrestlers managed those wants. The professional coaches managed the actual training. The program produced results. What changed, beginning in the late summer of 1988 and accelerating across the following 7 years, was that the behaviors became, in clinical terms, no longer eccentric. They became symptoms. The line between the two is not always easy to draw from the outside, in real time. It became easier to draw, in DuPont's case, after his mother died in August of 1988. The next chapter is The Warning Signs. Chapter 8. The Signs. In a small private cemetery in Wilmington, Delaware, on a morning in late August of 1988, a man in his late 40s stands beside the open grave of his mother. The other mourners are the surviving members of the family, the estate staff, and a small contingent of social acquaintances from the Newtown Square community. The deceased is Jean Lysander Austin DuPont. She has died at the age of 91 after a brief decline. The man in his late 40s is her youngest son, John. He returned to the main house on the estate later that day. He had not lived in the main house for approximately the previous decade. He had been living instead in the smaller residence several hundred yards to the south, where he had moved as a younger man. He moved back into Lysander Hall in the days following the funeral. He occupied his mother's bedroom. He kept her closets in the configuration they had been in on the morning of her death. He did not, in the months that followed, alter the furniture, the rug placement, or the wallpaper in any of the principal rooms. By the assessment of the forensic psychiatrists who would later evaluate him for the criminal proceedings of 1996, the death of Jean DuPont marks the chronological onset of John DuPont's paranoid schizophrenia. The diagnosis was not, in 1988, made by any clinician. The diagnosis was not, in 1988, considered by any member of the family. The symptoms began, by the unanimous testimony of the people around him in the months that followed, almost immediately. The first documented incident occurred in late 1988 or early 1989. John DuPont, sitting in the wrestling facility during a training session, drew a pistol from inside his jacket. He pointed it at the chest of one of the wrestlers on the mat. He told the wrestler that the wrestler was a Soviet agent who had been sent to assassinate him. He held the gun on the wrestler for approximately 10 seconds. He then put the gun back inside his jacket. He apologized. He left the facility. The wrestler, who declined to be named in the subsequent press reporting, did not file a police report. The training session resumed. The professional coaches did not, in the immediate aftermath, escalate the incident to anyone outside the facility. The wrestler involved continued to train at Foxcatcher for some months afterward, before quietly leaving the program. I want to pause here on what should have happened next, because the failure of what should have happened next is the structural fact underneath everything that followed across the next 7 years. In a household without the wealth, an incident in which a man pulls a pistol on a guest in his home and accuses him of being a foreign assassin produces, within 24 hours, a phone call to a family doctor, to a psychiatrist, to a local police department, or to all three. The phone call results in an evaluation. The evaluation results, in most American jurisdictions, in a brief involuntary hold for psychiatric examination. The examination results in a diagnosis, a treatment plan, and, at minimum, a course of antipsychotic medication. The diagnosed individual is, within a week of the incident, under some form of clinical supervision. In John DuPont's household in late 1988, none of this happened. There were several reasons. The wrestlers who were the eyewitnesses to the incident were beneficiaries of his foundation, not his employees in any legal sense, and they had no clear standing to report him to authorities. His siblings, who were the only people in the world with the standing to pursue a commitment proceeding, lived in separate residences and did not, in the late 1980s, have daily contact with him. His attorneys, who certainly knew of the incident within days of its occurrence, considered their professional obligation to be to him as a client, not to a hypothetical future victim of his behavior. The local police, with whom he had cultivated honorary relationships through equipment donations, were disinclined to act on reports about a substantial donor's eccentric behavior. The federation that depended on his money was not in a position to escalate. What happened, in lieu of clinical intervention, was that the household constructed a perimeter of professional management around the behaviors. He hired security consultants, he fired them, he hired new ones. The cycle continued across the period from 1989 through the early 1990s. The security consultants were tasked, in their own subsequent testimony at the trial of 1996, with managing the behaviors. They were not tasked with treating the underlying condition. They had, in most cases, neither the clinical training nor the legal standing to do anything more than de-escalate individual incidents as they occurred. The incidents continued. They escalated. By 1990, John DuPont was reporting, in conversations the wrestlers later testified to, that the walls of the mansion contained surveillance equipment installed by the CIA. He had begun, in the same period, ripping sections of the wallpaper and plaster from the principal rooms to look for the cameras. The damage was, in some rooms, substantial. The estate staff repaired what they could repair without arguing with him about whether the cameras existed. They learned to leave the rooms in their post-damage state when he indicated that the cameras might be in a particular location, so that he could continue to verify their absence. He claimed, in the same period, to see the ghost of a staff member's deceased wife in the upper rooms of the mansion. He claimed to hear voices in the hedges around the property. He believed, at various points across 1990 and 1991, that the trees lining the driveway had been wired with listening devices. He commissioned the cutting down of several of those trees. The estate staff cut them down. He had a section of pond on the estate dredged to look for buried surveillance equipment. The dredgers found nothing. By the early 1990s, he was telling the wrestlers, in casual conversation, that he was the Dalai Lama. He was telling them, on other occasions, that he was the last of the Russian czars. He was telling them, on still other occasions, that he was the Christ child returned. The wrestlers did not contradict him. They had learned, by the early 1990s, that contradiction triggered the more volatile responses. They humored the claims. They returned to their training. He believed that the Bulgarian wrestlers training on his estate were agents of Bulgarian intelligence. This belief is worth noting specifically because it was held simultaneously with his continued financial sponsorship of Valentin Yordanov, the Bulgarian Olympic champion, who lived in a residence on the property. He alternated, in his communications with Yordanov and the other Bulgarian wrestlers, between treating them as honored guests and accusing them of plots against him. The Bulgarian wrestlers, who had limited English and limited recourse, navigated the alternation as best they could. I want to acknowledge a difficulty here. The list of behaviors I have just described is partial. The complete list, as reconstructed in trial testimony and in the subsequent biographical literature, runs to several dozen documented incidents across the period from 1988 to 1996. The list includes, among others, the firing of 7 separate security consultants over disputes about whether CIA agents were following him, the installation of motion-activated lighting and audio recording in the wrestling facility, the periodic conviction that one or another of the wrestlers had been recruited by a foreign intelligence service to kill him, a series of telephone calls to law enforcement agencies, including the FBI, to report what he believed to be ongoing plots against his life, an episode in which he drove a Lincoln town car into the estate's swimming pool in the apparent belief that the pool was an enemy installation, and a separate episode in which he confronted a group of deer hunters who had inadvertently crossed onto the estate boundary, holding them at gunpoint until estate staff arrived to defuse the encounter. It is uncomfortable to enumerate behaviors of this kind in narrative prose because the cumulative effect is, in places, almost comic. The behaviors are, in the abstract, the kind of thing the surrounding community could plausibly have framed as the harmless eccentricities of an aging recluse. They were not. Each one, viewed in isolation, was the kind of incident that, in a different household, would have prompted a clinical intervention. None of them, in this household, did. In September of 1995, John DuPont confronted one of the wrestlers in the weight room of the training facility. The wrestler was named Dan Chade. DuPont accused Chade of conspiring against him. He held a handgun on Chade for approximately 90 seconds. He told Chade that he was considering shooting him. He then lowered the weapon and walked out of the facility. Chade reported the incident, the same day, to the Newtown Township Police. The police took a statement. They did not arrest DuPont. They did not, in any documented action, follow up on the report in a way that would have produced a clinical evaluation. Chade left the Foxcatcher program shortly afterward. The September 1995 Chade incident was, by every available account, the warning sign that the surrounding institutional structure understood most clearly. The wrestler involved had filed a contemporaneous police report. The behavior described in the report was specifically the kind of behavior that, 4 months later, would result in the death of Dave Schultz. The shooter had been formally identified in a contemporaneous police record as a man who held guns on wrestlers in his own training facility and threatened to shoot them. The information was, in late September of 1995, in the possession of the Newtown Township Police, of John DuPont's attorneys, of his security consultants, of his siblings, if they cared to inquire, and of the USA Wrestling Federation, which depended on his money. None of those parties initiated a commitment proceeding. None of them alerted Dave Schultz, the head coach of the facility in which the incident had occurred, that the patron of the facility had recently held a gun on one of his wrestlers and threatened to kill him. In the same period, another former Foxcatcher wrestler, Andre Metzger, was preparing a civil suit against DuPont, alleging behaviors that, in Metzger's account, had spanned several years of his association with the program. The Metzger civil action would, in its eventual filing in 1996, surface additional allegations of paranoid and threatening behavior dating back to the late 1980s. The action would be settled out of court after DuPont's arrest on terms that were not publicly disclosed. Mark Schultz, in his 2014 autobiography Foxcatcher, described his own years on the estate and his eventual departure in 1988, in language that has been, in the years since the book's publication, variously interpreted. He documented behaviors he found deeply unsettling. He documented an accusation against him by DuPont in 1988 of cocaine use that Schultz denied and that no other evidence supports. He documented his decision to leave the program. He did not, in the years between his departure and his older brother's death, communicate his concerns to Dave Schultz in a form that produced any change in Dave's living arrangements. The two brothers' relationship, by both their accounts, had become strained across the late 1980s for reasons that included, but were not limited to, the Foxcatcher situation. Dave Schultz, who lived on the estate from 1989 until his death, was aware of John DuPont's behavior. He told Nancy, in the months preceding his death, that the patron was deteriorating. He told friends and visitors that he was concerned. He continued, despite the concerns, to live in the Goshen Road farmhouse and to coach the program. The Atlanta Olympic Games were 6 months away. He was 36 years old. He was the top American freestyle wrestler at 163 pounds. He had, in his own assessment, one Olympic run left in him. He did not leave the estate. On the afternoon of January 26, 1996, John DuPont drove a silver Lincoln Town car into the driveway of the farmhouse on Goshen Road. The next chapter is what happened in court. Subscribe before the next chapter. It is what makes this kind of work continue to be possible. Chapter 9. The Trial. In the days following John DuPont's surrender at Lissitor Hall, the Delaware County District Attorney's Office filed criminal charges. The charges were murder in the first degree, criminal homicide generally, and simple assault. The first-degree count was based on the prosecution's contention that the killing of Dave Schultz had been premeditated. The simple assault count was based on DuPont's having pointed the revolver at Nancy Schultz after firing on her husband. DuPont was held without bail at the Delaware County Prison in Thornton, Pennsylvania. He underwent psychiatric evaluation across the months following his arrest. The evaluations were conducted by court-appointed examiners and by experts retained by both the prosecution and the defense. The unanimous conclusion of all of the examining clinicians, irrespective of which party had retained them, was that John DuPont met the clinical criteria for paranoid schizophrenia. The disagreement at trial was not over whether he had the disorder. The disagreement was over what the disorder had done to his capacity for criminal intent on the afternoon of January 26th. The trial began on January 21st, 1997, before Judge Patricia Jenkins of the Delaware County Court of Common Pleas. The lead prosecutor was Joseph McGettigan, the Delaware County First Assistant District Attorney, an experienced trial lawyer in Pennsylvania state criminal proceedings. The lead defense attorney was Thomas Bergstrom, retained by the DuPont family. The trial lasted approximately 5 weeks. It received continuous national press coverage. The defense argued for outright acquittal by reason of insanity, under the McNaughton standard then governing Pennsylvania criminal proceedings. The McNaughton standard required the defense to demonstrate, by clear and convincing evidence, that at the time of the act, the defendant had been suffering from a defect of reason, such that he did not know the nature and quality of the act he was committing, or, if he did know it, that he did not know that what he was doing was wrong. The defense produced expert testimony to that effect. The defense did not contest that John DuPont had pulled the trigger. The defense contested whether the John DuPont who had pulled the trigger had been, at the moment of pulling it, legally capable of forming criminal intent. The prosecution argued for first-degree murder. The prosecution acknowledged that DuPont was mentally ill. The prosecution contended that the mental illness, however genuine, had not eliminated his capacity to plan, to execute, and to conceal a homicide. The prosecution's case turned on three categories of evidence. The first category was the trajectory of the act itself. John DuPont had, on the afternoon of January 26th, left the mansion at the upper end of the estate, driven the Lincoln town car several hundred yards down the internal estate road to the farmhouse on Goshen Road, and stopped beside Dave Schultz's car. He had not driven there at random. He had driven there with a loaded revolver beside him on the seat. The drive itself, in the prosecution's argument, was evidence of intent. A man unable to form criminal purpose does not navigate a known route with a known weapon to a known target. The caliber of the firearm was, in the early reporting and in the criminal complaint, sometimes recorded as a .38, reflecting initial witness descriptions. The trial evidence established the actual firearm as a .44 caliber Magnum revolver, recovered in the mansion at the time of the arrest. The discrepancy between the initial caliber identification and the ballistic finding became, in the press coverage of the trial, a minor controversy. It was not a material element of the prosecution's case. The second category of evidence was the September 1995 Chade incident. The prosecution introduced Dan Chade's contemporaneous police report. The prosecution argued that the September incident demonstrated a pattern. DuPont, while mentally ill, was capable of pulling a handgun on a wrestler, threatening the wrestler with the gun, then making a decision to lower the weapon and walk away. He had, in September of 1995, made the decision to walk away. In January of 1996, he had made the opposite decision. The capacity for either decision, the prosecution argued, was the capacity to form criminal intent. The third category was the testimony of Patrick Goodale, the security consultant who had been in the passenger seat of the Lincoln. Goodale testified that DuPont, in the brief exchange between the lowering of the driver's window and the firing of the first shot, had said one sentence. The sentence was, in substance, a confrontational question about whether Schultz had a problem with him. The sentence, by the prosecution's argument, was evidence of intent. A man genuinely unable to recognize what he was doing does not deliver a confrontational rhetorical question to his victim immediately before shooting him. The defense responded to each category. The trajectory of the drive, the defense argued, was the trajectory of a paranoid episode, not the trajectory of a planned homicide. A man driving a known route in a paranoid state is not, by the defense's framing, exercising criminal intent in the legal sense. The September Chide incident was, in the defense's framing, additional evidence of a paranoid pattern rather than evidence of intentional control. The Goodale testimony, the defense suggested, reflected DuPont's general manner of speech and could not be read as evidence of premeditation in the absence of any other indicator. The trial, across its 5 weeks of testimony, drew sustained national press coverage. It began approximately 15 months after the conclusion of the O.J. Simpson criminal trial in Los Angeles, which had ended in October of 1995 with a not guilty verdict on the murder charges. The DuPont case was framed, in the early press coverage, as a structural parallel. A wealthy defendant, an unimpeachable physical case, and a defense built around questions of the defendant's mental state rather than questions of his physical actions. The parallel was, on closer examination, imperfect. The Simpson defense had been a general not guilty argument with specific challenges to the prosecution's forensic evidence. The DuPont defense did not contest the physical evidence at all. The factual question of who had pulled the trigger was, in the DuPont trial, conceded by both sides on the first day. The prosecution called numerous witnesses across the 5-week testimony period. They included Nancy Schultz, who testified about the events of January 26th and about her husband's awareness of John DuPont's deteriorating behavior in the months preceding. They included Patrick Goodale, the security consultant. They included Dan Chade, the wrestler from the September 1995 weight room incident. They included the responding officers from the Newtown Township Police, the Delaware County District Attorney's investigators, and the FBI agents who had participated in the standoff and the arrest. They included Foxcatcher staff members who had observed the deterioration of John DuPont's behavior across the preceding 8 years. The defense called its own slate of expert witnesses on John DuPont's psychiatric history. Dr. Philip Resnick of Case Western Reserve University, one of the most experienced forensic psychiatrists in the country, testified that DuPont's paranoid delusions had been so thoroughly enveloping in the period preceding the shooting that he could not, at the moment of pulling the trigger, have appreciated the nature of his act. Additional court-appointed psychiatric examiners testified along similar lines. The defense produced specific evidence of John DuPont's reported beliefs in the weeks before the killing: that Dave Schultz was a Soviet agent, that the FBI had wired the trees on the property, that the Bulgarian wrestlers were poisoning his food. The defense produced evidence of his behavior in the standoff after the shooting: his disoriented telephone conversations with Wochok, his apparent surprise when informed that Schultz had died, his apparent confusion about the events of the afternoon. The jury was instructed, under Pennsylvania law, that it had 3 possible verdict tracks available. The first was acquittal by reason of insanity. The second was outright conviction on one of the homicide grades, ranging from manslaughter to first-degree murder. The third was a finding of guilty but mentally ill, an intermediate verdict that the Pennsylvania legislature had codified in 1982 specifically to address cases like this one, in which the jury was confronted with a defendant who was both demonstrably ill and demonstrably culpable. The jury deliberated for approximately 7 days. On February 25, 1997, the jury returned its verdict. John Eleuthère DuPont was found guilty of murder in the 3rd degree. He was found simultaneously to be mentally ill within the meaning of the Pennsylvania statute that allowed for a guilty but mentally ill finding as an intermediate disposition between outright conviction and acquittal by reason of insanity. The verdict had practical consequences. DuPont had been found guilty. He would serve a prison sentence. He would be remanded initially to a psychiatric facility for stabilization. He would, upon stabilization, be transferred to a general correctional institution. He would not be released, regardless of medical recovery, until the sentencing court determined that he had completed the term of incarceration. On May 13, 1997, Judge Jenkins sentenced DuPont to 13 to 30 years in state prison. He was 58 years old at sentencing. He was, by the calculation any reasonable observer could perform, unlikely to be released alive. He was sent first to Norristown State Hospital for psychiatric stabilization. He was, after approximately a year of inpatient treatment, transferred to the State Correctional Institution at Mercer in western Pennsylvania, where he was housed in the general population. He was a model inmate by every account of the corrections officers who supervised him. He requested and received permission to wear, in his cell, the warm-up jacket bearing the Foxcatcher logo. He read. He wrote occasional letters. He maintained contact, intermittently, with members of his family. He went through annual mental health reviews. He was, by the unanimous reports of the examining clinicians across his 13 years of incarceration, stable on antipsychotic medication. He was no longer, in any clinically significant sense, the man who had driven the Lincoln Town car into the driveway. The medication had restored the function of his executive cognition. The medication could not undo the consequences of what the man had done before the medication had begun. Nancy Schultz pursued, in parallel with the criminal proceedings, a wrongful death civil action against the DuPont estate. The civil action was settled before going to trial. The terms were not disclosed publicly. Press estimates placed the settlement in the range of several $1 million, of which a substantial portion was structured into trusts for Alexander and Danielle Schultz. On December 9, 2010, John DuPont died at the State Correctional Institution at Laurel Highlands, the facility in southwestern Pennsylvania that accommodates aging and chronically ill state inmates. He was 72 years old. The cause of death, by the Pennsylvania Department of Corrections, was chronic obstructive pulmonary disease with acute aspiration pneumonia reported as a contributing factor in some subsequent accounts. He had served 13 years of a 13 to 30-year sentence. In May of 1997, after the original sentencing, the defense had filed a notice of appeal. The appeal challenged certain trial court rulings on the admission of John DuPont's prior paranoid statements. The Pennsylvania Superior Court rejected the appeal on procedural grounds in the years that followed. The defense did not pursue a further appeal to the Pennsylvania Supreme Court. The conviction became final approximately 2 years after the verdict. The Pennsylvania Department of Corrections classified him during the Mercer years as a low-risk inmate. He had no prior criminal history. He had no record of in-custody violence. He was, by the unanimous reports of the supervising corrections officers, polite, compliant, and consistent in his medication adherence. He received approved visitors. He maintained, in the prison's reading room arrangements, a small regime focused on natural history and the philately of the British colonial period. In the late 2000 decade, his medical condition deteriorated. He was transferred to Laurel Highlands, the corrections facility that specializes in the care of aging and chronically ill state inmates. He was housed in the medical unit. He was, by all available accounts, lucid through his final months. He was the only member of the Forbes 400 ever convicted of murder. He remains, as of the writing of this story, the only one. I want to pause here on what the verdict actually settled. The jury that returned the guilty but mentally ill verdict on February 25, 1997, settled the legal question that had been formally before it. It did not settle, and could not have settled, the broader question of how an episode of this kind became possible in the first place. The legal proceedings had focused, by the structure of American criminal law, on what John DuPont had done on the afternoon of January 26th, and on what he had known, in the legal sense, at the moment of doing it. The proceedings had not addressed, because they could not have addressed, the 8 years preceding the act in which the institutions surrounding him had failed to intervene. The verdict, in other words, named what had happened in the driveway. It did not name what had happened around the driveway. The next chapter is what happened to the estate and to the people in it in the years that followed. Chapter 10. Lissitor Estate. The driveway on Goshen Road is, in the spring of 2026, paved. It is part of a residential cul-de-sac on the southern edge of Newtown Square, Pennsylvania. The house at the end of the cul-de-sac is a 4-bedroom colonial revival single-family residence built between 2014 and 2015. The other houses in the cul-de-sac are similar. The houses are part of a Toll Brothers development of approximately 449 units that occupies most of what was, between 1919 and 2013, the Lissitor Hall Farm and Foxcatcher estate of the DuPont family. The development is called the Estates at Lissitor. The patch of asphalt at the head of the cul-de-sac is approximately where, on the afternoon of January 26, 1996, Dave Schultz was working on the radio of his car when the silver Lincoln Town Car pulled up. I have come back more than once across the writing of this story to that specific piece of asphalt. The years between 1996 and the present have rearranged the people involved in nearly every available direction. Nancy Schultz lived in the Goshen Road farmhouse for some months after her husband's death, then moved with the children to California. She founded, in March of 1996, the Dave Schultz Wrestling Club, the annual Dave Schultz Memorial International Tournament hosted by USA Wrestling at the United States Olympic Training Center in Colorado Springs. From the late 1990s onward, has become, by the accounts of the wrestlers who attend it, one of the most attended freestyle wrestling tournaments in the country outside the NCAA championships. She founded, separately, a wrestling development foundation in her husband's name. She accepted the settlement in the wrongful death civil action against the DuPont estate, the terms of which were not publicly disclosed. She testified repeatedly across the late 1990s and the 2000s at parole hearings opposing John DuPont's release. She continued to do that until his death in 2010. Alexander Schultz, the son, was 10 years old at the time of his father's death. He wrestled in high school and at college. He moved, as an adult, into coaching positions in the same sport his father had coached. Danielle Schultz, the daughter, was 7 years old at the time of the killing. She has spoken publicly about the case on a small number of occasions across the intervening decades. The family has, by every available account, declined to be defined by the killing. Mark Schultz, the younger brother, published his autobiography, Foxcatcher, in 2014. The book formed the basis for the Bennett Miller film of the same name in the same year, in which Steve Carell played John DuPont and Mark Ruffalo played Dave Schultz. Mark Schultz publicly disputed certain portrayals in the film, but acknowledged the underlying events. He continued, in the years since, to speak intermittently about the case. The Bennett Miller film received 5 Academy Award nominations. Steve Carell received a Best Actor nomination for his portrayal of John DuPont. Mark Ruffalo received a Best Supporting Actor nomination for his portrayal of Dave Schultz. Channing Tatum played Mark Schultz. Sienna Miller played Nancy Schultz. The film took, by every account of the people involved in the actual events, substantial liberties with the chronology and the inner lives of its principal characters. Mark Schultz, in particular, publicly objected to the film's portrayal of the relationship between him and John DuPont, an objection he subsequently softened in later interviews. The film nevertheless brought the events of January 26, 1996, to a much larger audience than they would otherwise have reached. The Dave Schultz Memorial International Wrestling Tournament reported, in the years following the film's release, a substantial increase in attendance. The Delaware Museum of Natural History was renamed, in May of 2022, the Delaware Museum of Nature and Science. The museum had closed in late 2020 for an extensive renovation, reopening under the new name 2 years later. The renaming, by the museum's public communications at the time, was intended to reflect an expanded mission beyond pure natural history into broader scientific education for the surrounding community. The birdskin collection remains the institutional core. The cabinets are maintained in approximately the same configuration they were in when they were first transferred from the Newtown Square estate. William DuPont III, John's half-brother, lived his adult life primarily in the Maryland thoroughbred breeding community his father had established. He was a substantial racing owner in his own right. He died in 2013. He had had no significant adult contact with John in the years after their father's death. The other DuPont siblings of John's generation died across the years between 2000 and 2015. The three older siblings did not, by any available account, mourn John in public. The family's formal communications around the time of his December 2010 death were brief. The DuPont Company itself, the corporate entity that E.I. DuPont had founded and that had grown across the subsequent 2 centuries into one of the largest American chemical firms, merged with the Dow Chemical Company in 2017. The merged entity, Dow DuPont, was subsequently broken up into 3 independent successor companies in 2019. One of the 3, retaining the DuPont name, continued the specialty chemicals business. The other 2, Dow and Corteva, took the materials sciences and agricultural divisions respectively. The Hagley Museum and Library in Wilmington, the institution that preserves the family's and the company's historical archives, continues to operate as an independent nonprofit. The family papers, including Pierre Samuel's 1810 letter and the records of every Brandywine explosion, are still maintained there. The USA Wrestling Federation continues to operate from Colorado Springs. It receives substantial federal Olympic funding. It no longer receives the kind of single-donor patronage that John DuPont's involvement had represented across the late 1980s and the 1990s. The Federation's professional administrators learned from the experience of 1996 that the structural risk of letting a single private donor dominate the funding of a national sport extends beyond the financial. The Foxcatcher Foundation itself was wound down in the years following John DuPont's incarceration. Its assets were distributed under the terms of the eventual probate settlement. Valentin Yordanov, the Bulgarian wrestler who had lived on the estate through the early 1990s, won his Olympic gold medal at the Atlanta Games in the summer of 1996, 6 months after Dave Schultz's death. He retired from competition shortly afterward. He was, by the terms of John DuPont's will, as filed in Delaware County, the principal beneficiary of the estate. The will allocated approximately 80% of DuPont's net worth to Yordanov and his relatives, with the balance going to a private wildlife foundation. The exact dollar value was disputed at probate. The estate dispute between the DuPont siblings and Yordanov ran for several years before reaching a settlement. The settlement terms were sealed. The other named beneficiaries of John DuPont's will, including various wrestling organizations and the Delaware Museum of Natural History, received bequests of disputed scale. The estate itself, the 800 acres of pasture and woodland and farm buildings around Lysander Hall, was sold in 2012. The buyer was the Toll Brothers Home Construction Company. The purchase price was reported in regional real estate press at approximately $58 million. The transaction closed late that year. In January of 2013, the mansion was demolished. Lysander Hall, the 3-story Georgian residence completed in 1922 as the wedding gift home of William DuPont Jr. and Jean Lysander Austin, was reduced to its foundation across approximately a week of mechanical demolition. The Welsh ponies had been sold. The Guernsey dairy herd had been disposed of decades earlier. The Foxcatcher thoroughbred racing operation had been wound down on William DuPont Jr.'s death. The wrestling facility, the converted barn in which the warning signs of John DuPont's illness had played out across the late 1980s and 1990s, was demolished separately. The site was graded for residential construction. The construction of the 449 homes proceeded across the following several years. The streets were named for elements of the estate's prior life. There is a Lissitor Road. There is a Foxcatcher Lane. The roses from the formal gardens were dug up. The cabinets containing the bird specimens had long since been transferred to the Delaware Museum of Natural History, which was renamed in 2017. The collection itself remains there, in cabinets that are, by the assessment of the museum's professional ornithologists, one of the most comprehensive, privately assembled bird skin collections of the 20th century. John DuPont's body was returned, after the December 2010 death at Laurel Highlands, to the DuPont de Nemours Cemetery on the family property in Wilmington. He was buried, by his own prior instructions, in a red Foxcatcher wrestling singlet. The instructions had been included in the will. The family complied. He lies, in 2026, in a marked grave a short distance from the grave of E.I. DuPont, his great-great-grandfather, who had founded the company in 1802 and who had died of cholera or of a sudden cardiac event in 1834. I want to pause here on what disappears when a place like this disappears. A working estate of 800 acres in suburban Pennsylvania is not, in the end, a private domain. It is a piece of regional infrastructure. It employs people. It produces, in its working years, dairy and horses and competitive athletes. It generates news. It shapes the surrounding tax base. It becomes, across the decades of its operation, a small node in the daily life of the community around it. The disappearance of the estate, when it disappears, is not just a property transaction. It is the loss of a community fixture. The fact that the community fixture had become, by the early 1990s, the site of an unfolding clinical catastrophe does not negate the prior history. It complicates it. I have, in the course of writing this story, walked the perimeter of the Toll Brothers development. The streets are well laid out. The houses are well built. The trees the developer planted are, in 2026, at the point in their growth where they begin to provide canopy over the cul-de-sacs. The development has, in the standard manner of well-executed American suburban subdivisions, become a functioning neighborhood. The neighborhood is not, in any sense visible from the street, haunted. The neighborhood does not know it is built on the patch of ground where the only member of the Forbes 400 ever convicted of murder shot an Olympic gold medalist 3 times in the elbow, the chest, and the back. The patch of ground, of course, does not know either. This is the story of the family that built American gunpowder. It is also the story of the heir who killed an Olympic champion in front of 2 witnesses, and of the 8 years of warning signs his money made it convenient for everyone around him to ignore. Both stories are, at the historical scale, the same story. They are about what one of the wealthiest American family fortunes ever assembled became, after the people who originally assembled it had been replaced by their great-great-great-grandchildren. The fortune did not, in the end, destroy itself. It funded a museum. It funded political campaigns. It funded a wrestling program. It funded the household in which a man with a documented decade of paranoid behavior was, by the structural failure of every available institution around him, never compelled into clinical treatment until he had killed someone. The DuPont company still exists. The Delaware Museum still exists. The Dave Schultz Memorial International Wrestling Tournament still runs every year, now in its 3rd decade. The wrestlers who lived at Foxcatcher still coach, still mentor, still compete, still talk about their friend among themselves. The driveway on Goshen Road has been repaved. The houses are well built. The trees are growing. Subscribe before the next story. It is the only thing that keeps this kind of work going.